as UK became early. I know that there will be many guest speakers tonight, that Sena's got all sorts of people to come along for you. But I would just like to start with my colleague Wes Streeting. Wes.
Thank you. Oh, swapping microphone. Okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Wes Streeting. I'm the Member of Parliament for Ilford North on the London-Essex border. I've been Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils since I was elected in 2015, and I'm really delighted that we've got this Tamils for Labour event in Parliament this evening, because for the last, I think for the last 2 or 3 years actually, I've been going out to Geneva every year to lobby around the Human Rights Council resolution in advance of securing that resolution, and now crucially making sure that that resolution is actually held to. I, like Siobhan, Stephen, and other MPs, are acutely aware from our own conversations, you know, with our Tamil constituents, of just how important this issue is, not just in terms of the historic war crimes and atrocities that were committed during the Sri Lankan Civil War that we're here to reflect on and remember tonight, but also the ongoing concerns about human rights abuses in Sri Lanka today, and particularly at this moment in the political cycle in Sri Lanka, the spectre of the return of the Rajapaksas and what that might mean for everything that we have done and have been able to achieve. When the present Sri Lankan government came in, there was a moment of optimism and hope in this country and in the international community that we might finally be able to get the process of truth, justice and reconciliation that I believe all of us want to see. When the government of Sri Lanka put its name and authority to that UN Human Rights Council resolution, accepting, among other things, that there would need to be international involvement in the investigation into and prosecution of historic war crimes and abuses, that seemed like a real breakthrough moment. It was unthinkable just 5 years ago to imagine that the government of Sri Lanka would sign up to a unanimous Human Rights Council resolution. And since then, there has been progress, but I think all of us know that that progress has been too slow, it's been non-committal, and in the most important elements of that resolution, the involvement of international prosecutors, bringing independence and confidence to the process. Not only has the government of Sri Lanka failed to live up to the commitments that it signed up to, but also we see leading government figures rejecting outright any kind of willingness to abide by the resolution that they signed up to. And that's why international pressure is really important. I think all of us understand, particularly given the prospect of the Rajapaksa's return, that Sri Lankan politics is difficult, that there are lots of people around the government, around the military, around the judiciary, senior voices in civil society who have a vested interest in making sure that those historic crimes that were committed are never uncovered. We also know that many of those individuals continue to be complicit in ongoing human rights abuses, and that puts the present government of Sri Lanka in a difficult place. But that's why it's so important that our government and others are applying international pressure, so the government of Sri Lanka can look and say, look, we've signed up to this, we've made these commitments, and look at the pressure from the international community. Look at the consequences that might follow if we break our word that we have made in front of every country at the UN Human Rights Council. We have been keeping our government's feet to the fire on this. I think it's fair to say that we're not generally as Labour MPs fans of Tory ministers. I think it's fair to say that the current Tory minister is a mild improvement on the previous minister in terms of understanding some of these issues. But there is always that risk, particularly in the context of Brexit, that trade trumps human rights in our conversations with other countries. And actually, I think it's really important, particularly as we leave the European Union or talk about leaving the European Union, that we're clear that the preferential trade status that Sri Lanka currently enjoys with the European Union will not continue with the UK and with our government if they fail to deliver against the commitments they've made to us under the UN Human Rights Council resolution. So this is a difficult moment. I kind of came away from Geneva earlier this year more anxious than ever and more determined than ever to keep this issue on the agenda of our Parliament, on the agenda of the UN Human Rights Council, particularly when the High Commissioner changes. The current High Commissioner has been brilliant at keeping Sri Lanka under the spotlight, but we will be determined to keep that pressure up and to make sure our government, whether through the UN Human Rights Council resolution, through the Commonwealth or through our bilateral relationship, continues to keep the pressure up on the Sri Lankan government, because there can be no doubt whatsoever of the seriousness, the horrors of the crimes that were committed during the Sri Lankan civil war. There can be no doubt whatsoever that when those crimes were committed, to our shame, the international community looked the other way and failed to live up to our responsibility to protect innocent people in Sri Lanka. There can be no doubt that even after all of the warm words about changing the course and marking a new start for Sri Lanka, that there are still people today who are victims of human rights abuses. There can also be no doubt that there are people in our constituencies and in our casework who face deportation to Sri Lanka by our own government, even though their safety would be at risk were they to be deported. And there can also be no doubt that the return of the Rajapaksas would be a total disaster. It would turn the clock back. It would be a return to the dark days of the past where none of us want to go. But I hope that I can reassure you and my colleagues this evening, particularly, the Labour MPs, the very senior Labour figures that you'll be hearing from this evening, will be able to reassure you that we are absolutely determined not to let the Tamil community down again in the way that they were during the Sri Lankan Civil War, that we are absolutely determined to make sure that those commitments that Sri Lanka signed up to at the Human Rights Council are upheld, and we are absolutely determined to make sure that the future of Sri Lanka is a bright one that is made possible through that crucial period of truth, justice and reconciliation. And that is why your presence here this evening, the letters, the emails that you send us, appearing in our constituency surgeries on Fridays and Saturdays, all of that work you do is so important because it concentrates minds. It makes sure that all MPs keep our focus on this really important issue. So I just want to conclude by thanking you for the time, the effort, the energy that you put into campaigning on these issues. I know that in so many cases, it's in the context of deep personal tragedy, and these aren't easy issues to talk about, to reflect on, to remember, but you are making a difference, and we are determined to make a difference for you too. Thank you.
To see everybody here as well. I really want to lasted for so long. And I also want to express thanks on behalf of the Labour Party for all of the support that we enjoyed from Tamils for Labour and from the Tamil community in the elections in London earlier this month. We had wonderful results in our part of London, and indeed very good results across London. Fantastic results in Wes's constituency. And there's absolutely no doubt, I think, in the minds of all of us, that the very strong support we had from the Tamil community was a very important element of our success. Wes was talking about the latest stages in the United Nations process. And I was just looking this afternoon at what the report produced by the High Commissioner said, reported to Geneva in February. And it's a pretty sorry account that the High Commissioner presented. So a whole range of issues the report went through. On the comprehensive transitional justice agenda, the High Commissioner said concrete results have yet to be delivered. On the report of the Consultation Task Force on Reconciliation Mechanisms, which had been a positive element in the previous report from the High Commissioner, the verdict this time was that it's not yet been endorsed or officially reviewed by government or parliament. On the Office of Missing Persons, selection and appointment of the commissioners is still continuing. On ratification by Sri Lanka of the International Convention for Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, that was ratified by Sri Lanka on the 25th of May 2016. The High Commissioner in the report this year, 2 years on, says it's yet to be translated into domestic legislation. On the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, public consultation and discussion not yet underway. On accountability, very little preparatory work. So hardly any progress has been made since the last report. And alongside that, and as Wes has already indicated, the High Commissioner says that incidents and controversial statements by some ministers have eroded the government's full commitment stated to improving the human rights situation. The use of torture remains a serious concern, and the report also refers to multiple incidents of intercommunal violence, attacks and hate speech against minorities. And the report concludes that the fulfilment of commitments made has virtually stalled for more than a year. Progress is insufficient and conclusive. So I think what Wes has said is absolutely right. We need to maintain the international pressure on the authorities in Sri Lanka to fulfill commitments they have already made. And I think we need to say this to our government, that some of these promises were made to David Cameron in person, representing the British government. And that does place, I think, an onus and a responsibility on the current British government to make sure that those promises made to the leader of the Conservative Party as our Prime Minister are honoured. They've not been honoured. There's been things have stalled for a year, and I think there is a special responsibility on the British government to make sure that commitments that it accepted, that its leader accepted in the past, are delivered, and that they mean what they said. Thank you.
To make this meeting possible today. Joan Ryan.
Oh, right. Thank you, Siobhan. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see so many faces that I recognise. We've worked together for so long on this issue. I'm here tonight to join you in honouring all those who perished in 2009. We'll never forget what happened in that armed conflict. I'm also here to pledge my ongoing support and steadfast support to the Tamil people and to the cause of truth, accountability and reconciliation, which is what we are all working towards. I do believe war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed against the Tamil people. I have no doubt in my mind that that is what happened. And this culture of impunity that persists to this day means that human rights violations are still being perpetrated against many of your family and friends on the island of Sri Lanka. If Sri Lanka is ever to truly be set on the path to reconciliation and lasting peace, then it is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that truth and justice prevails. There is no other way we get the reconciliation that is so badly needed. I know that some of you, after 9 years, may be losing confidence that we'll succeed in this effort. But I ask you not to be despondent. You know, and we know, we can't let this go. And I think of the words of Nelson Mandela, who said, "It always seems impossible until it is done." So we have to carry on, and we will. And I want you to know, and I'm sure you do from the things that my colleagues here are saying to you, that we will continue this struggle for truth, for reconciliation, and ultimately for peace. And remember, it was sustained pressure from victims and activists, many of whom are in this room here tonight, and the international community that finally secured the UN Human Rights Council resolutions on Sri Lanka. And I just wanted to pay a little tribute here to my friend Wes Streeting, because I know you've been going to Geneva of recent years and fighting very hard to hold Sri Lanka to account and for us to hang on to the resolutions and have them properly implemented. So it's only through working together and continuing to bring pressure on President Sirisena's government that there'll be meaningful progress to address the events and the legacy of that armed conflict. And although we know he was involved in that armed conflict and has a case to answer himself, we were so optimistic when Rajapaksa was deposed and Sirisena became president that we would find a way forward. And it is so very disappointing that that has yet to happen. But I can assure you that we will continue to support all efforts to ensure an enduring peace in Sri Lanka and the recognition of the Tamil people's fundamental rights and freedoms. And for all that we can do, we will. And we will never let this go until we have justice. And that's why we are here. And that's why we insist on having debates in this House, however much of a nuisance it might seem to some. And the other thing we say to our government is trade doesn't come before human rights. It's not a choice, trade or human rights. If our government made the right commitments, had the right conversations and put the right strength behind it, then we maybe could have both. That will be our demand. Thank you very much.
There is going to be a bit of an interregnum. I don't know, Sen, if you have other speakers you'd like to call on, but for a while I think there may not be very many MPs because we're anticipating a vote in a few minutes. And after the vote, I understand that Jeremy Corbyn is coming, John McDonnell, Jonathan Ashworth, Barry Gardner, Fabian Hamilton. I hope you all can stay awake. Stephen Pound and Gareth Thomas. So, Sen, do you... we are just joined by a relatively new friend of the Tamil people. I hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Appreciate the invitation. Where is Sen? Sen, there you are. Great to see you. Thank you so much. I'm Kato Samor, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Edmonton, but I'm also on the front bench, and my area of expertise is international development. Now, first and foremost, I just want to tell everybody in this room, way before I was an MP, I had a lot of very close friends who told me about the conflict and told me about the experience at the hands of those evil people in Sri Lanka. So first and foremost, we must remember those people that lost their lives during the Civil War, but we must also come together and commemorate how far we have come. We must never forget those people that lost their lives. So I thank you for making sure that the Labour Party remains your friend, remains on the front foot of an issue, because self-determination, human rights, social justice is fundamental to the Labour Party. But more importantly, it is important to all of us as Member of Parliament in our everyday life. It's something which connects us all. And that's why it is important that we're all here together today. But more importantly, I must say thank you for supporting the Labour Party, because that is something we must never ever take for granted. Because the struggle of those people that have lost their lives, those people who haven't had the answers that they deserve, that is important to the Labour Party. So your support for us is in return support for you. And that's why we must always come together, not only to commemorate, but to find out how we can push this important, fundamental, important issue to the forefront of legislators. It mustn't be something where we come together and we feel down together, we become strong together, we hold hands together and we push forward. Because if we push forward, we will get the answers that are so just and so sometimes out of reach, because we feel people are not listening. So we use this time to come together, learn from mistakes, come forward, but fundamentally, human rights is at the forefront and is the cornerstone of the Labour Party. So thank you for always remembering us. We will never, ever forget you, because we are stronger when we're all together. So thank you so much.
As I said, we are expecting many more front bench people as well as MPs to come. As you know, already lots of them come through. What I'll do now, we also have prominent people who are working with the Tamil community and the international organization to help the cause of the Tamils. One of that person is Barrister Patrick Lewis. Barrister Patrick Lewis is Garden Court Chambers, specializing in advice, representation and advocacy in all areas of immigration, asylum, nationality, deportation, detention, EU free movement and human rights law. He is a committed and passionate advocate for justice in the UK for over 25 years. Patrick will speak on Vanni and Windrush now.
Thank you very much for that introduction. As the speakers have already acknowledged, there is a real acknowledgement of the failure of the international community to have intervened in those last final stages of the war. And the human rights abuses that occurred during that time could have been prevented if the international community had acted correctly and appropriately. And it's in that context, I think, then we have to look at the ongoing failure of the international community, but perhaps focusing on our obligations in this country to ensure the protection of human rights for those Tamils who are continuing to face the violation of their human rights. And in my practice, that's been largely focused upon the attitude and the approach that's been taken by the Home Office to asylum seekers in this country, which is tragically so consistent with that failure that occurred by the international community before. And the consideration of this hostile environment, which I would suggest continues towards asylum seekers in this country, has to be seen in the context, of course, of the extraordinary level of human rights abuses that continue today in Sri Lanka. Now, those abuses that occur in Sri Lanka today are not ones that are simply claimed, and I don't mean in any way dismissive of that, but it's not simply those that are claimed by asylum seekers here in the United Kingdom, or indeed by lawyers who might have an interest in trying to argue those human rights abuses in this country when they're representing individuals who are claiming asylum. The level of human rights abuses that are occurring in Sri Lanka and ongoing violations are not simply those claimed or argued by human rights lawyers, but it's accepted by the Home Office in a case which reviewed the situation for asylum claims in this country, in the situation as it prevails in Sri Lanka, presented the tribunal with extensive information about the situation as it occurs in Sri Lanka. And with that information, the Home Office conceded, so this was not a finding of the tribunal, but a concession on behalf of the Secretary of State, that the situation in Sri Lanka was such that it was accepted that individuals in custody in Sri Lanka continue to be at risk of physical abuse, including sexual violence, and that such risk is persecutory. So that's an acceptance by the Home Office of the situation as it prevails within Sri Lanka. And so it's in that context, again, that the acceptance of the type of abuses that occur then also must be considered. Again, this is the Home Office's own assessment of the situation of the violations that continue today. So, and I won't read out all of the account because it's just too graphic, it's too horrific, perhaps even a public meeting. That includes beating with cricket bats, iron bars, rubber hoses, suspending individuals by wrist or feet, burning with metal objects and cigarettes. That's the Home Office's own description of the risk for individuals who are returned to Sri Lanka. And so again, it's in that context that one has to consider how does the Home Office continue to approach asylum claims by individuals. And again, the tragedy that we face is one that's known by so many who are here today. It's one where the Home Office will continue to rely upon discrepancies that are not there. They will continue to rely on purported implausibilities that are in fact entirely plausible. And in fact, on occasions, in my own experience, in my practice, it goes beyond that because it actually goes to potentially misleading the tribunal as to the plausibility of an account. I'll just give this as one example. Because, of course, when one is considering an asylum claim from Sri Lanka, one is considering the most extraordinary circumstances. Circumstances that we in this country are fortunate not even to be able to imagine, but for ones that in Sri Lanka become the norm. But within Sri Lanka, of course, the most obvious thing that could be asserted against an individual as to why their account should be rejected would be the fact that they got here through the airport. How is that possible? And repeatedly, the Home Office will rely upon the fact that an individual was able to come through the airport and claim asylum as reason to reject their account. Now again, one must consider that so many asylum seekers are unrepresented, or where they are represented, they might be poorly represented. And so there is a very real duty on the Home Office when they're considering these claims not to mislead, and in fact to guide. But this is the concession, another concession, not finding, made on behalf of the Secretary of State. It was accepted that at the airport, given the prevalence of bribery and corruption in Sri Lanka, having left Sri Lanka without difficulty was not probative of an adverse interest by the authorities. But nevertheless, ongoing, on a daily basis, the fact that someone leaves through the airport is relied upon by the Home Office to reject the account that's been provided. Now, just earlier, by chance, I looked up on the board as to who's speaking, and it was Lord Mackay of Clash Firm speaking in a debate. I don't know what that debate was about. But Lord Mackay of Clash Firm was a Lord Chancellor under Margaret Thatcher. And once he addressed immigration judges, and in that address to immigration judges, he referred to the fact that in asylum claims, It's the one remaining court in the land where issues of life and death are still considered. That is the importance of the issues that are decided. And it's in that context, again, when we're talking about this hostile environment, that tragically does continue. That hostile environment is one where the Home Office, rather than approaching cases with that acknowledgement of risk, their own acknowledgement of risk, in fact, what the Home Office will do repeatedly is to mislead and to, for the most vulnerable of individuals, who are often being subjected to the type of treatment which has left them very clearly damaged. It's in that context then that the failure of the Home Office must be considered the failure of the international community when we failed to intervene in those closing stages of the war, which led to thousands of people being killed. Then there is that ongoing duty, I would suggest, that we now approach asylum claims from Tamils and from Sri Lanka with the care that should be afforded to them. Thank you very much.
So we're gathered here today 9 years on after May 2009, when I'm sure a lot of us were out in the streets outside Parliament protesting to get the voices of our people in the North and East heard. So I thought it'd be nice to start with an extract from some information from WikiLeaks that shows the level of information that was being given to foreign governments at the time. So here's a quote from the last days of the end of the war, where civilians were leaving the no-fire zone. They attempted to escape the no-fire zone with a large group of children, coming out with white flags. The Sri Lankan army started shooting at them and told them to go back to the bunkers. Later, sources told us that soldiers threw grenades into 2 bunkers and then saw tanks going over the bunkers and destroying everything in sight. So this was the level of information coming out of the North and East at the time when Sri Lanka had expelled international NGOs and expelled journalists. And it's good to know that this was out there in 2009. So now where are we now 9 years later? So due to intense work from the Tamil diaspora and international NGOs, we managed to get the UN Human Rights Council to launch an investigation into what happened in the final stage of the war. And in 2015 we had the OSL report, which outlined atrocity crimes and mass atrocities that were likely committed by the Sri Lankan government. Also, as a result of intensive lobbying by activists and NGOs, Sri Lanka was not forced, but Sri Lanka was made to agree to sign up to the Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1, which called for an international justice process that included foreign judges and Commonwealth judges to provide justice for the final killings at the end of the armed conflict. Now, the UN quoted numbers of up to 70,000, and local census figures in the North and East found that at least 140,000 Tamil civilians were missing, according to census records taken after 2009. So that's where we are now. And the deadline Sri Lanka was given to deliver on its commitments on the resolution was March 2017. It was March 2017, yes. And in 2017, when Sri Lanka was reviewed at the UN Human Rights Council, it was given a further 2 years to deliver on its commitments. And now it's 2018, so it's good to now take stock of where we really are. So since 2017, People for Equality and Relief in Sri Lanka, which is a think tank based in Washington, in a recent report have said, since 2017, the highest levels of Sri Lanka's government has repeatedly rejected the notion for accountability for war crimes and prosecution of military leaders that could have been involved in the mass execution of Tamil civilians. And this has happened 30 times, with the President and senior level ministers of Sri Lanka's government reiterating their rejection of the UN Resolution 30/1. And that's where we are now in May 2018. And in terms of tangible deliverables that the Sri Lankan government committed to, So, whilst they failed on actual justice and tangible progress towards justice, they've also failed on low-hanging fruit or tangible deliverables that they could have committed to over the last 3 years. So one tangible deliverable was relisting a list of surrendees that handed themselves over to the Sri Lankan government during the final stages of the war. Now, several eyewitnesses have said that they saw senior military officials alongside government officials taking records of names of people that handed themselves over to the government at the end of the war. And we still are yet to see the government release a list of these detainees. At the same time, we've had the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture visit Sri Lanka just last year and say that torture was routine and endemic and the Tamil community within the northeast bore the brunt of the state's well-oiled torture apparatus. Sri Lanka Campaign and other rights organisations like the International Truth and Justice Project and Freedom from Torture UK have repeatedly outlined ongoing torture issues in the northeast of Sri Lanka and have repeatedly provided cases from the new government of the President Sirisena regime. Yeah. And torture is just one ongoing issue. A second issue which Sri Lanka again committed to in 2015 was to move towards demilitarising the north and east of Sri Lanka. In 2015, Sri Lanka's foreign minister at the time went to the UN Human Rights Council and said by 2018 the north and east would return to normalcy and the disproportionate military numbers in the north and east would be reduced. Now, Pearl, a think tank in the north, based in Washington, who recently conducted research in the northeast of Sri Lanka, alongside a think tank based in Jaffna called Arialam, found that in Mullivaikal, which was one of the most heavily affected regions in the north and east, there still remains a ratio of 1 to 2 singular soldiers per Tamil civilian. Now, official Sri Lankan government army stats say that the size of the Sri Lankan army is 180,000 personnel. And it's well known that at least 75% of Sri Lanka's army is situated in the north and east. So that's essentially a military that's bigger than the size of the UK's military, situated in an area which is the northeast of Sri Lanka, which is just 1/8 of the size of the UK. And now this is a singular military essentially occupying a traditional Tamil homeland in the north and east. Now, the militarisation of the north and east is it's not just in terms of numbers, but it's also in terms of the impact that the military has in the north and east. So the military is still extensively involved in land appropriation, and this land appropriation has resulted in Tamils from the north and east launching protests which have been sustained for over a year now, where we have mothers of families who have disappeared and we have families who have been internally displaced, have been on the roadside continuously protesting for the reinstating of their lands, and also protesting for a release of the list of families of the disappeared personnel. And as well as appropriation, the military is involved in the agricultural economy of the north and east. So the military has set up a faction called the Civil Security Department, which looks to employ former Tamil cadres in the north and east to work for the military, and it gives them a wage. But what this does is it enforces the deprived community of the north and east to rely on military structures for their ongoing well-being. And at the same time, the CSD, it forces the Tamil workers in the north and east who work for the CSD to report to military camps and receive training at regular intervals. Now, the question remains, why has Sri Lanka continued to fail to be able to normalise the situation in the north and east, where the Tamil community is allowed to prosper and the economy in the north and east is allowed to return to normalcy, and where the ongoing militarisation is allowed to be reduced? And the question why goes back to the surrounding context. Now, the ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka is not something that started from the armed conflict. It's something that started right after independence in Sri Lanka, where we had 30 years of Tamil political struggle for securing equal rights, which then resulted in 30 years of an armed struggle. And the key component that has blocked repetitive Sinhalese governments or Sri Lankan governments from delivering on an equitable solution to the Tamil people has been their need to pander to singular Buddhist nationalism on the island. And this is something that all parties have had to pander to, regardless of the political spectrum. So whether it's a liberal west-facing government or a singular nationalist government, both types of governments have always had to pander to singular Buddhist nationalism. And it's gone as far as when, at key moments when governments have signed pacts with the Tamil polity in the north and east, there's been mass protests led by Sinhalese Buddhist monks that force governments to renege on their commitments to the Tamil community and rip up pacts and change the rhetoric to suit the singular majority. And actually, in the current climate, it's something that's not so hard to conceive, because even liberal political ideologies in Sri Lanka have always been pervaded by Buddhist nationalist sentiment. And when you look at Myanmar, that's a typical example where you had someone like Aung San Suu Kyi, who was seen as an ideal liberal candidate to bring Myanmar into reform, who's unable to speak about the ethnic cleansing of Christians and Muslims in Myanmar. And the pure reason for this is because there's a type of singular Buddhist nationalism that pervades all different types of political leniencies in democracy in South Asian countries. And this is where the argument will go to when you look at Sri Lanka. Many people will argue that Sri Lanka is not really a democracy, but it's actually an ethnocratic state, which really means we should frame the way we look at Sri Lanka and foreign policy in Sri Lanka in a whole new way. And the key thing to remember is, despite this in Sri Lanka, and despite 70 years of ongoing struggle, the oppression and the oppression of the north and east, the Tamil people have not stopped resisting. So over the last 2 years, we've seen this mass upsurge in protests by just activists who don't need Tamil political leadership, but they continue to protest. At the same time, we've seen mass rallies where thousands of people have rallied through the north and east, calling for the same ordeals that the armed struggle fought for, which is self-determination, the evolution of powers, and now further calls for justice for war crimes and mass atrocities. And that's the issue. So as we've seen in Gaza, when you look at states or areas that have gone through 70 years of ongoing oppression, the resistance never ends. So Sri Lanka is always going to be an issue. And so the question is, what now? Well, we can look at the British polity, and the UK Tamil community numbers to something like 400,000, and it's on the rise. So Sri Lanka is not just a foreign policy issue, but it's a British issue. And we can look at how, if we look at just the Labour Party itself, we can look at the Labour Party manifesto. And the Labour Party manifesto, in terms of foreign policy, it addresses Palestine, and it addresses other issues like issues in Congo and issues in the Middle East with country-specific policy. But when you look at Sri Lanka, it's still not mentioned in the Labour Party manifesto. And it's really something now that the Labour Party can start thinking about in terms of when we've had 7 decades of ongoing issues in Sri Lanka. It's really something that's not going to end in the next few years. And it's something where we do need manifesto commitment into committing to what the Tamil demands are on the ground and what the Tamil demands are in the Tamil diaspora. And these demands have been clearly outlined, where they've always called for an equitable solution that respects the self-determination of the Tamil nation, ongoing justice, which includes, or committing to a justice process, which includes international judges, due to Sri Lanka's repeated failure of the successive governments to deliver on accountability, and also to secure demilitarisation and normalcy of the Tamil North and East, where the military numbers have reduced across the Tamil North and East. So these are things now where the Labour Party should really look into including into the Labour Party manifesto, as they have done with several other nations in the country that have faced prolonged ethnic conflicts for over 7 decades.
I think we got Nina, but I will wait until the others come also for you to speak and put them in the picture what is actually happening. Just, I know like Fabian, even though we didn't met so far, I think we have been campaigning since 2006 very, very vigorously about the issues in Sri Lanka. Nothing happened. You can see even today, after 9 years, what happened there, that, as far as we are concerned, it's a genocide, and we're still working to get some justice. Nothing happened. People are very frustrated. I must also say, when the Labour Party was in government, we had access to the Foreign Secretary before David Miliband. I can remember very well in room 14 in the main parliament, he addressed a meeting like this, around 200 people at the height of the war. People were really upset, and he looked at the civil servants and said, almost like, why you didn't tell me so far? And he addressed the Tamil people and said, I am your Foreign Secretary, I will take it on from now. When this WikiLeaks came, one HCO official complained, David Miliband is spending more than 60% of his time on Sri Lankan issues. That is why I just want to stress the fact, whatever you do, campaigning, helping, talking with the MPs, like MP suggested, sending emails and keeping them in the picture will eventually work. Please don't give up hope. The message we are getting is people losing interest in politics. We are wasting our time, sort of thing. No, we have to persist. So with that note, I will ask Fabian to say a few words.
Very kind of you. Thank you very much. Do you want me to stand up? Yeah,
yes,
stand up.
Yes.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for welcoming me here this evening. I just need to correct something you said. I'm not the Shadow Minister for Sri Lanka, unfortunately. I was a couple of years ago, and in that role I went to Colombo for a few days. However, I am the Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament, so I think that's even more relevant, actually. Yes. And I bring you, first of all, greetings and apologies from Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. She would very much like to have been here, but like all Foreign Secretaries and Shadow Foreign Secretaries, I'm afraid she's got several appointments at the same time. So she asked me to come on her behalf. I hope you don't mind this substitute. I'm not second best, I apologise, though I can't quite live up to her excellence. But we work as a team. And the strength of the Labour Party, and this is Tamils for Labour, the strength of the Labour Party is that we genuinely do believe in working for the many, not the few. Now, I know that sounds like a slogan, but what it means in reality, and I caught the end of the last speech, and sorry, I don't know your name, but it was very interesting to hear what you said. Because primarily, and this is one of the things that I always say to any audience I address, especially when it's an issue like this that is so emotive, that is so distressing, and that is so important to many, many people in our communities, that we believe in the rights of peoples to self-determination, wherever that may be in the world. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to do as the Shadow Minister for Peace and Disarmament is that because I don't shadow a government minister, there is no Minister for Peace and Disarmament, as you know, but there will be under a Labour government. And our role, our idea, our philosophy is going to be to work with every government department. You mentioned, sir, David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary, a man I know very well and still do, as somebody I respected enormously. But we want to expand on the role and the work of David Miliband, a Labour Foreign Secretary, and Robin Cook, who started out with the ethical foreign policy. We want to build on that to create what we call a peace philosophy, a peace doctrine. And the idea of that will be to ensure that every Department of State of the British government that faces outward from this country, whether it's education, development, the military through defence, whether it's diplomacy through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office or soft power through the BBC, is coordinated together to make this country, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the preeminent power in the world for creating peace, for preventing conflict, and for post-conflict reconstruction. As well as that, we want to use our already powerful role in humanitarian affairs to save the lives of people who either might be the victims of a genocide before it happens, and to work through the United Nations and other partners for peace to ensure that where there is a threat of violence, the possibility of murder, that we try our best to prevent it. Now, that sounds like a tall order in today's world. But looking at the history of the conflict in Sri Lanka, and the conflicts that are happening at the moment throughout the world, and you referred, sir, to what's happening in Gaza. And let me tell you that I am Jewish, but I am horrified at what I have seen on the TV screens. I am horrified at the idea that anybody who is peacefully protesting for their own rights and self-determination should be murdered in cold blood with hunting rifles and ammunition that is just appalling in its devastating effect on any living organism. That is unacceptable anywhere in the world. I don't care who's doing it. And the question I ask myself is, if you want to stop people doing what they were doing and hold them back from the border, what's wrong with water cannon? It's a non-lethal way of stopping people attacking you. It may hurt, but it doesn't kill or maim. And this is what we need to do as a human race. We need to ensure that the tendencies we might have to be angry and use violence to settle our disputes and our conflicts is put to one side. That we find peaceful and non-violent ways of settling our differences. And whether it's Mahatma Gandhi or any other philosopher, or whether it's His Holiness the Dalai Lama, it doesn't matter. Any philosophy that teaches us that we can together solve our differences through the one thing that we have as an advantage over the rest of the animal kingdom on this planet, our ability to communicate using language, our ability to use rational thought to settle our differences, and argument. You know, at the moment, we are experiencing the death of liberal discourse throughout the world. The idea that we can disagree with one another, but settle our differences peacefully. That is disappearing. There may be many reasons for it, but one of them I know is inequality. Inequality of opportunity, inequality of income. And there is only one party in this country that stands for equality and the creation of a fairer, more equal society, and that is this Labour Party. And the current leadership of the Labour Party is absolutely, truly committed to that. And I believe strongly that to correct the faults, the horrors of the past, that many of you in this room will have experienced or suffered, we have to build that better society. And it is based on equality, the equality of each and every one of us with one another, and the equality of opportunity, of provision, of income. These are the most important things. And that will help us to build peace, to build a more peaceful society here in the United Kingdom, and more importantly, a more peaceful world out there. This country can lead through its language, through its governance, through its history, through the respect that we still have in many parts of the world. We can be the leading nation for humanitarian relief, for peace building and for conflict prevention. That is something we are determined to do. It is something that Jeremy Corbyn has charged me with preparing. But I know that all the shadow cabinet are behind this. So you have us as your close friends. We will do what it takes to ensure that something like this terrible tragedy, Mullivaikal, cannot happen again. That the terrible conflict in Sri Lanka cannot happen again. It is a tall order, but unless we work towards it, we don't have that hope that we can build a better future for ourselves, for our children, and for our successors on this planet. And we have to make sure we do that, otherwise there is no future. So I thank you for inviting me today, and I thank you for inviting me to share those thoughts and views with you. You are all part of this project that we have to build a better Britain, and through that a better world. We can do it, but only if we work together. Thank you for listening.
So our next speaker going to be Barrister Nina Tavakoli of Red Lion Chambers. Nina will speak on her recent work for the International Truth and Justice Project in Sri Lanka. Nina has extensive experience in genocide and war crimes prosecutions and has been engaged on some of the most high-profile cases in recent times. At the Special Court for Sierra Leone, Nina was Prosecution Appeals Counsel on the case of Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, who was convicted of war crimes. At the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Nina was a legal advisor to international judges on numerous trials of senior Rwandan government and political figures for genocide. She also worked in the Defence Office of the War Crimes Chamber of the Court of Bosnia. In the UK, Nina defends and prosecutes in the Crown Court. She brings her wealth of experience internationally to bear on her UK cases. Can I ask Nina to say a few words?
That's it. Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. I work... Is it? No. Just like that, that's fine. I also work, and that's the capacity in which I'm here today, as an investigator for the International Truth and Justice Project Sri Lanka, which is an NGO that I'm sure most of you have heard of. We collect and store evidence for any future credible justice process that may occur in Sri Lanka. I'm also, incidentally, a member of the UK government's Foreign Office team of experts in preventing sexual violence in conflict. I've been an investigator for ITJP for just over 2 years, and in that time I've documented about 20 or so recent cases of torture. I sit down with an investigator I sit down with a translator approximately once a month for 3 to 5 days, and we sit down with current victims of torture. Since 2015, ITJP has documented 76 cases of torture and sexual violence perpetrated by the Sri Lankan Army and Police since 2015. All but 3 of those victims that I have interviewed have been men. I'm often the first person that they have talked to about what they have experienced when they have been in detention. In short, they're abducted and detained by Sri Lankan Army and Police for a number of days to a number of months. In detention, they are tortured and often sexually violated. I'm the first person that they've spoken to, which is obviously difficult for them. There is a huge amount of stigma and shame associated with sexual violence, and many of them are struggling to understand exactly what's happened to them. I've had women in floods of tears, shaking uncontrollably. They just can't understand what's happened, and they fear for their prospects for the future. They're also coping with separation from their families. Some of them may never see their families again that they have left in Sri Lanka. They're in a new country, they're learning the language, and they're coping with the brutal trauma of what has happened to them. So what is clear from the statements that I have taken from the 20 or so victims and from the other victims that ITJP has documented is the abduction and torture is systematic, which is important in terms of legal categorisation. It's systematic both in the reasons why people are taken, the methods of torture, the methods of abduction, and the release pattern. The people that this government are targeting are generally low-level political operatives, so young people who are giving assistance to local Tamil MPs, those who are assisting them campaigning for commemorative events, and also human rights campaigners that are documenting potential war crimes. They're also picking up people who are returning from abroad, students who are visiting relatives who all thought it was safe to come home under this new government. It has proved not to be safe for them. In addition, some of them have been carders of the LTTE or have family members who are carders. The majority of those who I've interviewed have been in their 20s. So these are not people that have been fighters in the war, contrary to the rhetoric of the government. Some of them have been abducted, tortured and detained more than once. There are also patterns in their abduction. There are generally 3 teams of abductors. You have those that abduct, those who interrogate, and those who facilitate their release. The abduction follows roughly the same pattern. Now, obviously not every torture that I and the other investigators document is the same. However, what is clear is that there is a pattern, and that means that this is not simply rotten apples in the security forces. It can't be, because the patterns are the same. So, for example, just a few examples, when they are abducted, they're asked to confirm their name. They then hand over their IT card, which is not returned. The men who come to get them are generally in plain clothes with some weapons. They are taken inside a white van, blindfolded and handcuffed, and taken to purpose-built torture centres. The torture centres, they generally see two places: the holding cell, where they sleep and are given food, and where 9 times out of 10 the sexual violence occurs, and also the torture room, which are fully equipped and ready for torture. They are equipped with metal rods, poles, sort of buckets full of water, often chains coming down from the ceiling. There may be a table, and so on. There are also, interestingly, biometric fingerprint machines. These type of machines are not used by organised crime syndicates. Then the questions are similar. There seem to be 3 types of questioning that are coming from these people. Firstly, the reorganisation and regrouping of the LTTE. Secondly, the money. Where is the money? Where are the weapons? And thirdly, overseas networks. I've seen and interviewed a number of individuals who have been students in the UK, returned home to see their families, and whilst they were here, they protested and participated in protests. They have these photos and they are showing them. So they are surveilling people on the streets of the UK. The torture has, the types of interrogators has changed. They now, unlike in the war, they now have learnt Tamil. So a lot of the torture sessions are going on with investigators speaking in broken Tamil. The torture also follows similar patterns. Of course, not every victim's experience is the same, but generally speaking, the torture methods that are being used even today, we've had a number of cases from last year. This is ongoing and systemic. And the torture up to date includes falaka, so the beating of the feet, the branding. They're marking tiger stripes with hot poles down the backs of the Tamil men. Beating with pipes, sand-filled pipes, metal wires, other types of pipes. They are burning with cigarettes, particularly the women. There's also, they're putting their heads under water, holding it there. Then you have asphyxiation, polythene bags filled either with chili powder or petrol that's put across the head. They hold it here. Eventually somebody, of course, one passes out. The patterns are the same. They're detained in the holding cell. They're moved to the torture cell where they are tortured and interrogated. They're moved back. There is no respite when they get back to their torture cell, because this is predominantly where the sexual violence occurs. This is quite interesting because whilst victims can often recognise and give you a description of the torturers in the main room, by the time you ask them to give you a description of the sexual violence, they can't. And I don't know whether or not that is because the shame is just so great, which is what I think it is, that they just are struggling to remember the faith. They don't want to remember it, they can't think about it. And so they just give a vaguer description. They described often the torturers being in drink. They smell the alcohol. The women are burned on their breasts and on their body and below their sari line so that this will be seen whilst this sexual torture is going on. It's anal, vaginal rape and oral rape. The men also suffer anal rape either with bodily parts or with implements. It can be repeated. It is often repeated over a series of days. The language that is used throughout the torture, but particularly during the sexual torture, is racial. Tamil dog and so on. There is no doubt that these individuals are being targeted because they are Tamil. Eventually, they are released, and this is a racket of bribery and people smuggling networks. So again, the same pattern seems to occur. Somebody brings them new clothes, different people come, their release is facilitated through a bribe that is paid by their family, often with the facilitation of the political party EPDP, and they then exit Sri Lanka via quite convoluted, sometimes, people smuggling networks. They're in Colombo airport, we think there are people in cahoots because they're often told to go to this check-in counter to check out, through this border gate to check out. So they're going through specific people. There are routes that cross Africa, routes that cross the Middle East, and eventually they end up in the UK and they claim asylum. Once they are out, their families are surveyed and harassed by the Sri Lankan authorities so that they don't talk, which is another trauma that faces those that I interview. They can't speak to their family anymore because they know that they're being targeted. A lot of our work is independently verified, so to speak, by doctors from Freedom from Torture and so on. So 55 out of those 76 cases so far have forensic medical legal reports, which are forensic reports corroborating the torture that we have documented. These allegations have been repeatedly brought to the attention of the Sri Lankan government, and there has been no action taken. It is quite clear that there is a culture of denial. And as a result of this culture of denial, there is no accountability. And this creates an environment in which this torture continues. It's clearly collective punishment intent on humiliating and eroding the Tamil community. And this is in contrast to the current government's rhetoric around reconciliation.
So, Jeremy, you just missed Nina explaining what is happening in Sri Lanka and the torture still happening.
I'll read the notes when you take the next speaker then.
Yes, what's going on and so on. So it's a very, very horrific picture we saw. So I think what I like to do, I like to call upon John McDonald because he was listening to the statements by Patrick and Nina and our colleague here. So I'd like you to reflect on this. And also I'd like to remind you, John, the UK taxpayers' money, something like £6 million, recently spent on training the Sri Lankan armed forces and military police, and you can hear from independent sources what sort of job they are doing using that money. So I'd like to hear from you what you can do to bring it to the attention of the current government until we get into the power so that we can sort it out. I must say, when you listen to these things, you don't know whether, what to do. Yeah. So,
Can I just thank Nina for the work that she's doing. The account that she's given is horrendous, but reflects what we've all known for a number of years. 9 years ago, we were all together in Parliament Square trying to draw attention to the then government to what was happening in Sri Lanka and the massacre that was going on. But before then, most of the MPs that will be joining you tonight will have had constituents like mine who went back to Sri Lanka and just disappeared completely off the face of the earth. And then secondly, we had constituents who had family members coming over for a whole range of mechanisms through different routes, exactly as Nina has said, some really circuitous, long journeys seeking safety, recounting exactly as Nina has said, in fact, some even more horrendous examples of the torture that went on. And then they were greeted in this country by being arrested, taken to my constituency and then detained in Harmersworth or Colnbrook detention centres. And then, some of you will remember, because we protested time and time again, the government then booked flights, put them all on flights, on individual groups of them on particular airplanes, and sent them back, where they then went through the whole process again, being arrested at the other end, some of them being disappeared and others then go through torture again. And that was the climate that we were protesting 9 years ago, and even well before that as well. And it was Patrick's referred to the hostile environment climate that existed then, but also subsequent.
It's very, very reassuring to hear the commitments you made, and it's up to the Tamil people, us, to make sure we work with the Labour Party to deliver those very important things for our society. I must also say, in this conflict, the affected people are the very poor, vulnerable, women, children. I must also say the better off people came to Western world, even to Columbus to some extent, but we have to make sure the people out there protected, and we have to reach to the right party to do that. I'm sure that's very important here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party. Jeremy, it is fantastic to have you here with us this evening. You are a great friend of Tamils. You and Labour have always stood alongside and spoken up for the Tamil people. As you know, we are 9 years removed from the horrors of Mullivaikal. The sense of grave injustice at the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Sri Lankan government on our people burns as brightly for Tamils now as it did then. Many Tamils are losing faith that truth and justice will prevail and that we can deliver the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Tamil nation, including self-determination. Our job is to convince them that politics can and will bring about the change we seek. But we need your help, Jeremy, now on so many issues. With your leadership, and as a proudly internationalist party, Labour can help effect meaningful change in Sri Lanka too. By bringing pressure to bear on the UK government and the international community, you can help ensure that the Sri Lankan government finally fulfills its UN Human Rights Council commitments on justice and reconciliation. We need your vigorous efforts to help guide Tamils to achieve their right of self-determination, a cause you have always supported. Yours and the party's efforts are so important for keeping Tamils believing in hope, and that genuine solution to the Tamil people's mounting concerns will emerge. We all know that the Sri Lankan government is hoping that the genocide they committed on our Tamil people will be forgotten in time. But we will never let that happen. And with the help of the Labour leadership and Labour MPs, we can help to deliver positive outcomes to the Tamil people before the 10th anniversary Mullivaikal next year. Let us hear now from our friend and leader, Jeremy Corbyn, on all these issues, and in particular, the right to self-determination for the Tamils and how he can help. Jeremy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today as somebody who first became involved with the Tamil issues in 1983, I've seen the steadfastness of the community, your brilliant ability to organise and mobilise, and the woeful ignorance of so much of the British media about what is happening to the Tamil people even now. I've never forgotten the 200,000 strong march we had through London, which got barely a mention in any national newspaper in Britain. 200,000 people is a very big demonstration and march indeed, and it was just largely ignored. And in the days of the original, well not the original, the days of serious problems in the 1980s, the Tamil organisations came together, and much later on Tamils for Labour was founded. And I'm very grateful that you did found Tamils for Labour, because not only does it give a voice to the Tamil community within the Labour Party, which I absolutely welcome, what it also does is ensures that the Labour Party is well informed on issues facing the community, and you have had a huge influence on the policies that we have adopted. This is the anniversary of that dreadful massacre. It is a commemoration of the ending of the war period when thousands of people died in a most brutal manner. But as everybody said at that point, that if there isn't truth, there isn't justice, there isn't reconciliation, there isn't an understanding of the rights of people to determine their own future, then the problems are merely being laid on one side to come back again later on. There has to be serious action taken to bring about peace and justice for the Tamil people. If there isn't, then I'm worried for the future in so many different ways. During a visit I made to Sri Lanka in 1984, I had a meeting with the then President Jayawardena, and we sat down for about an hour, and he said, "What do you want me to do?" And I said, "Well, a lot of things, but first of all, repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is such a terrible piece of legislation, which is such a denial of fundamental judicial rights, and is a way in which many wholly innocent Tamil people are being locked up and denied access to justice." Sadly, all these years later, that legislation is still there, accompanied by even more draconian legislation, as your report absolutely points out. And as if things have not got worse, as we know, the report that we now have a very large number of documented cases of torture against Tamil people from the camps or in the north and east shows that an awful lot more must and has to be done. Now, the Labour Party is a very big party, represents people all over Britain, and we see ourselves as absolutely an internationalist party. The watchword of our foreign policy under a Labour government will be international justice, respect for international law, will be basing our relationship with all countries on human rights and their respect for human rights. So we raise human rights concerns with every country we meet now, irrespective of how big or small or powerful or otherwise they are. Because if we want to live in a world where we have the rights of free speech, we have the rights of assembly, we have the rights of independent trial, we have the rights of a free and independent media, then I want the same for everybody else all around the world. And if we sign up to, as we do, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the proceedings of both the Human Rights Council as well as of the European Convention on Human Rights, then we have to mean it. And I intend to lead a government that will make sure human rights is our watchword around the world. That is the Labour way, and that is the Labour principle that we will be adopting. Of the issues that are before us today, there are a number of things, but I think the points that you put forward, the 4 fundamental points that Tamils for Labour put forward, I think are a good start for us. an international judicial mechanism to address the crime of genocide, war crimes and crimes against humanity and other international crimes committed by the Sri Lankan state, and ensure justice is served for the victims of enforced disappearances. Because it's easy to say the word enforced disappearances, but having worked with families all over the world who've had people that have disappeared, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, many, many other countries around the world, the pain of not knowing what happened to your loved ones is unbearable. It goes on and on for years. The desperate search for closure to knowing exactly what happened. That is why a commission is so important. Secondly, a political solution that recognises multilingual, multi-ethnic and multi-religious nature of Sri Lanka as a society. And, of course, the right of Tamils to decide their own future. That exactly is the central to everything that's been said over the past few years. And, as I said earlier, the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act because of the powers it gives of arbitrary arrest and detention without trial, and the release of all political prisoners. Britain is in a strong position to make that demand, and pressure from the Tamil community encouraged, if not forced, David Cameron to go to Jaffna during the time that Choggum was being held there. I would want to see Labour government sending our diplomats to all parts of every country in the world where there are issues of human rights abuses, arbitrary detention or allegations of torture, and ensure that they are investigated. And the last point is the demilitarisation of the Tamil homelands in the north of the island, and releasing all occupied lands and allowing people to return to their homes without delay. Because for all the killing and all the brutality and all the horrors, if you just put it on hold and don't deal with the fundamental causes, the discrimination and the abuse that led to them in the first place, then the danger is of a future in which that misery continues. And so I want to say thank you for inviting me along here today. Thank you to my colleagues, Fabian and John and others that are here tonight and have spoken on it, but also the assurance I want to give you is that the Labour Party fully understands the issue. It's included in our manifesto. It will be included in our manifesto in any general election, which, by the way, we hope comes very soon. Very, very soon, please, because we cannot go on like this in this country or anywhere else in the world. And again, thank you for inviting me here tonight.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that reassurance which Tamil people are looking for. And you can see from the faces here, like you said, the biggest problem for us not knowing whether the son and the daughter and the father and the mother still alive or dead. You won't believe, Jeremy, the mothers are protesting for more than a year in Sri Lanka, day in, day out, no one noticing it. That is where we need the help. And thank you very much for coming today, and thank you for everyone to come here and listen to us and do this.
Emily sends her support and regards. She couldn't, she's got another event on this evening, but the whole Foreign Office team are fully seized of the whole thing.
Thanks, Jeremy. And as you have noticed, we had several Labour MPs visited us and spoke. The next speaker I'd like to invite is Gareth Thomas from Harrow West to say a few words.
When Jeremy first went to Sri Lanka, I was just 16 years old. So I cannot compete with him in terms of knowledge and length of service to the Tamil community. But the one thing that I have that he does not have is the fact that I have a bigger number of Tamil constituents in Harrow than he has in his constituency. And my constituency is all the better for it, to be honest. The largest number of Tamils anywhere in any constituency in the UK live in Harrow West, and it's something that I continue to be very proud of. I have seen people in my constituency surgery who've taken items of clothing off to show me the scars where they were tortured by the Sri Lankan police and some of the paramilitary units that you will all know about. I have had constituents in my surgery talking about land that they used to own having been taken away from them. I've had people showing me again and again that terrible Channel 4 film coverage of extrajudicial executions taking place at the end of the conflict. And every Tamil who comes to see me, quite rightly, reminds me of the failure of the international community to force the Sri Lankan government to deliver on the commitments they made to support a UN-led inquiry into what happened at the end of the conflict. And we must never, as a community, and we must never, as a Labour Party, give up on that demand for justice and for that inquiry to go ahead. One of the lessons from South Africa's coming to terms with its apartheid past was the need for truth and the need for reconciliation. And you cannot have either without having justice, without people being allowing the truth to emerge as to what happened. And that still isn't happening in Sri Lanka, as you all know. I was a Minister for Trade at the end of the last Labour government. And we led the European Commission into taking Sri Lanka off the GSP Plus list of countries. And it is, I think, to Britain's eternal shame and to the current Conservative government's eternal shame that they have supported Sri Lanka being allowed back onto the GSP Plus list of trade preferences without having made sufficient progress on human rights, without that UN-led inquiry having taken place. So I will always continue to raise human rights abuses in the House of Commons. I will always continue to press for that UN-led inquiry, alongside Jeremy and John and Tamanjeet and other Labour MPs who've come and supported that. And I know that those of you who are from my constituency, those of you who are members of Tamils for Labour in particular, who live in my constituency, I know that you will always expect me to do that, and you will always continue to campaign for that to happen. And I welcome that passion and strength and determination from the Tamil community and from Tamils for Labour in particular. I pay tribute to Sen for his leadership of Tamils for Labour. Sen, you are very important, but if you'll forgive me for saying again that I think the Harrow Tamils are even more important than the rest of you, and I see Mr. Yogalingam and one or two other dodgy characters from Harrow in the room, and it's fantastic to have you all here. I'm not sure if there's anybody else from any other constituency. There are so many Harrow people in the room. It's great to have you here. I wish, in a way, that we didn't need to have an event like this. That there wasn't a need for Tamils for Labour. That there wasn't a need for the British Tamil Federation. But there is, and you all know why that is, and I pledge again my determination to stand by the community and to continue to do my job in Parliament alongside others to campaign for better human rights for the Tamil community.
Our next speaker is Tan Dees. He is the MP for Slough, and I'm sure for the Tamil community, sort of new, but I'm sure you have already got the update about what's going on and so on. I'd like you to say a few words, please.
Thank you very much, Sen. Labour, as I think we all know, is the party for justice, for social justice, for equality. And while the likes of myself may not have the experience of the likes of Jeremy or John or Gareth in terms of the links with the Tamil community and the level of detail. What you can be assured of is that all MPs, Labour MPs, will be there to make sure that we are fighting for justice, that we are fighting for human rights, and that we are calling out discrimination and persecution wherever that may be occurring around the world. Now, in terms of some of the things that have happened in Sri Lanka, I myself have visited Sri Lanka with my wife, but we never actually got the chance to go towards Jaffna and towards the north and the east. And while I was listening to the harrowing accounts which Nina was so eloquently explaining to the rest of us, is that what you have experienced as Tamils in Sri Lanka is similar to what many other persecuted peoples from around the world have suffered, including whether it's Sikhs as a minority. That's something that I can empathise with yourselves. Now, in terms of when there are human rights abuses, when people do not listen, when you're seeking that justice, when you are seeking that reconciliation, you need people who are going to help you. And I'm so glad that we've got Tamils for Labour in terms of the excellent work that you're doing to bring out these issues, to make sure that these issues are not just forgotten. When I read your paper in terms of the lack of disclosure, that is not something which is just there for the Tamil community. In terms of, I know that you try to get disclosure for the meetings that occurred between British Prime Ministers and Sri Lankan Prime Ministers. Likewise, the Sikh community have been talking about disclosures for more than 30 years to ascertain what actually happened between different governments. So there are so many things that you can draw upon, and you can work with like-minded individuals in other communities as we collectively seek justice for Tamils. Now, let me reassure you, while I may not have the same number of Tamils within the Slough constituency, that I am here to stand in solidarity with yourselves, and also to assure you that as you seek that justice and reconciliation, that you have got a friend here. And I look forward to working with yourselves as not only that we seek justice for yourself, but also as we seek a Labour government which will make sure that the tables are turned, and that whereby human rights and that cooperation and collaboration around the world is put at the forefront, rather than just looking into trade and looking into how we can increase trade with other nations, which is exactly what the Tories seem to be doing more and more, and I think that they're renowned for that. So that is a message that we need to take out to the community. But thank you very much for your kind invitation, and I look forward to working with Tamils for Labour in the future as well.
Thank you, Tan. And as you have already listened to many speakers who committed to the real concerns of the Tamil people, I know many people wanted to ask questions as well, because I don't want to sort of turn this into a question and answer session. But still, my belief is if Sudarshan wanted to ask one question, because you wear too many hats. One of them is from Tamil Guardian as well. Yeah. So I may allow you to ask one question again.
Sure. Hi Jeremy, I'm Sudarshan from the Tamil Guardian, which is a UK-based article newspaper which also focuses on human rights in Sri Lanka. It's funny actually, because 3 years ago when I went to the UNHRC with Liberation, I actually spoke to you, and you told me when I went there, you said, don't tell them what they want you to hear, tell them what your people want you. Tell them what your people want them to hear. And 3 years on, we're still in the same battle. I guess the question we have here is, we're at a stage where Sri Lanka's been given a 2-year extension with the UNHRC process, and it's completely reneged on all its commitments. And now we have a situation where the Human Rights Chief has also said we need to look beyond the Human Rights Council, and he's asked member states of the Human Rights Council to explore other avenues. So in terms of the Labour Party, what ideas or what can the Labour Party push for in terms of policy, in terms of ensuring justice and accountability in Sri Lanka?
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you for going to the UN Human Rights Council that time. I remember that conversation very well and the intervention that we both made there. I've been attending the Human Rights Commission, which before it became the Human Rights Council, for a very long time, and I've been at many, many events at it. And I was pleased when the Commission was wound up and the Human Rights Council replaced it with the 5-yearly peer group review of the human rights in any one country. So each country is then subjected to a 5-yearly review of its own human rights record. I thought that was a good thing. And the initial round of reports showed up a whole lot of things in many countries, of course, including Sri Lanka, which kind of hit the top box in just about every area. And in some cases, there are hundreds of items of concern, and then on the second review, there's meant to be a report back, or if it's very serious, a special rapporteur is appointed by the Human Rights Council in order to investigate. The problem with the UN Human Rights Council system is, what do you do if after 5 years or even 10 years you're still having a whole list of very serious concerns about disappearances, about the murder of journalists, about torture, about arbitrary detention, about camps and all the horrible things that have been reported in Sri Lanka? What do you do there? So I think you then have to move on to what Tan was just talking about, which is the next stage. What are you going to do economically in relation to that country? Do you have a normal trade relationship with a country that you know is allowing its people to be tortured and so on? My answer would be no, you don't have that. You have to move the stage on a stage further. And what we're doing is formulating a foreign policy that will be in all of those directions. And so my experience at the Human Rights Council is something that I'm bringing to bear on how we develop a foreign policy for the future that will be very different and totally unprecedented in British history. We can't pride ourselves with support for human rights if at the same time we don't do anything about it when we know that human rights abuses have been carried out. And I go back to the point on disappearances. Put it this way, a long time ago, in the late 70s and early 80s, there were awful events happened in Argentina. A lot of people disappeared, and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo have demonstrated for 30 years in the Plaza de Mayo in the center of Buenos Aires in Argentina about the disappearance of their children. Eventually they forced the later government to do some investigations, and some of those disappeared children were eventually located and found. The pain they went through to achieve that was unbelievable. I feel for and understand the pain that Tamil people are going through of just not knowing what happened to your loved ones and those disappearances. And so if we don't stand up and say something about it, who will? It's up to us to do that. And I'll tell you what, I'm very determined the Labour Party is going to be the political party in Britain that stands up, says that and does that, both in opposition and hopefully very soon in government as well. Thank you very much for your question.